All right. Welcome, Truth Talk listeners. We are going to be doing a new segment called Tea Time, where Father Douglas and this week's guest, Brother Bentley, will be answering the questions that I'm going to be presenting to them now. So, question number one, did we land on the moon? Go.
Yes.
The evidence would seem to suggest that.
That's all you got? Okay.
That was more words than yes.
You're right. Okay.
Okay.
So you can pull at that thread some other later podcast. Go ahead.
All righty. And question number two. Do we like cowboy leadership, so leading from behind, or do we like a man that leads from the front?
Well, as a pastor, I'll let Andrew speak as the business executive. As a pastor, it's disqualifying to be a cowboy. You're a shepherd, and shepherds stand out in the front, and the sheep follow and know your voice. So it's activated by your speech, by your presentation. And so every time I've seen the roughshod, cowboy get behind them, fire the pistols, woo, yell, throw the ropes, it ends up being a stampede.
I would agree. I would say you can't lead where you haven't been. You can't tell what you don't know. I think leading from behind looks cheap, it looks insincere, and it looks cowardly.
Yeah, I would agree. I definitely think that. It's fascinating to me to watch. We'll not go long into this, but it's fascinating to watch where certain men, and especially like in the 80s, older elders, kind of had a cowboy approach, and it worked. Surprisingly, it worked. But there was, I think there was always in the men that made it work, there was a transition where they would say, yeah, but he was like a father or a grandpa to them. So there was, for instance, Ellie Westberg, he was the famous, kind of a wild Rough Rider leader. But when I got to that church and I started like interviewing and talking to a lot of them people, they were like, yeah, to maybe somebody he was like that. But to his church, he was grandpa. He was our father. He was a tender figure. So even though he had the brand and the persona of Rough Rider kind of, they seemed to, if they made it work, all have a tender kind of day-to-day approach. You ever?
Yeah, no, 100% I would agree. I think for me that what it conjures up for me is this idea of, pithy aphorisms, these little statements that you lead by these truisms, these simple but in sometimes profound truisms that have value. But the problem is life is more complicated than a fancy statement.
Yeah.
Life is more complicated than, especially the days we live in now, it's so dynamic that to create a one-size-fits-all, this is the way we ride,
Yeah.
doesn't seem to work in the current culture anyways that we currently live in.
Yeah, I would agree.
Thank you for your time talking about this. Now, Father Douglas will be kicking off the actual episode.
Welcome to Truth Talk. As you just endured Preston's tee-off moment, which was all designed to get me to just say random stuff that he can make a reel out of. But we're happy that you're here. And I have a dear friend of mine, Andrew Bentley, with us today. And we're going to just kind of unpack some of the news from last week. Welcome to Truth Talk, Andrew.
Thank you.
Glad that you're here.
Thank you.
And you probably got a lot to say about Zelensky and Trump.
There's no doubt I have a point of view.
Yeah.
Some of it good, some of it bad. It's, if nothing else, it's entertaining.
Yeah. Trump did hit the nail on the head at the end. He said, if nothing else, it's going to be great television. Exactly. And he was right. The world lined up a few days ago to watch that. But let's not get into a ton about let's not get into a ton about like the broader war and the justification of whether or not the war. I don't know what your views are. I didn't screen you. I'm just having fun with this. I think Ukraine is completely they're on the moral high ground on this one. As far as they were invaded, they've lost 20% of their country. We've got a lot of Ukrainian people in our church around us that they have strong opinions about it. Now, be that as it may, they've lost some of their footing, and the only real way to do that without going into World War III is to try to put the U.S. footprint over the rare earth minerals. And then Russia says, okay, now if we go like to this next city or next place, now we're engaging in, a unilateral attack against the United States. So it's a bit of craftsmanship there in the political sense. I see where, like, I don't know if you've ever seen The Guardian, the paper from England, where they have all the things they said before the war started. Ukraine is corrupt. It's neo-Nazi. I mean, they loaded for bear, right? And then as soon as the war starts, they're a great freedom-loving country. So there is a lot to be argued about whether or not the war is justifiable or whether or not it's, what is the moral high ground of it. But let's, for the sake of time here today, let's focus from a leadership communications perspective. Okay, so you're watching that. You've been at high stakes in corporate government. The Wall Street Journal put out an article on February 28th. Trump-Zelensky meeting implodes. So they're calling it an implosion, right? When you watch that, what'd you view it as? Just the general way that it went. We'll get into the details.
Yeah, so it would seem to me that there was a failure of communication from a leadership perspective, that the responsibility of transmission probably supersedes the responsibility of receipt, that the person communicating has the first obligation to good, clear transmission. You can't go back after the fact and say, well, he didn't hear me. Maybe you didn't communicate appropriately. And so I think about that from a leadership perspective, that these, I call them the 7 considerations of communication, which is, who do I need to say it to? When do I need to say it? What do I need to say? When do I need to say it? Why do I need to say it? Right? All of these considerations. And it seems to me that it was devoid of much consideration at all, that it was a pretty provocative and responsive communication as a result. He got lit up, and as a result of getting lit up, he just responded in a way that, from a leadership perspective, I would say would not be strong communication.
Okay. So when Trump's bringing him there, Marco Rubio said on some interview he was doing that there had been 10 days of solid phone calls, solid green lights. He said, we would have never brought the guy here if we didn't think it was going that way. So there's a few back channeling things that came out. He landed. Did you hear where he went when he landed? So he goes to Congress and meets Adam Schiff. Shifty Schiff, they call him. The guy who said that Trump was involved in Russian collusion. And so Schiff puts out this post 1 hour before the meeting saying, just met with President Zelensky, had a great meeting, don't know how it's going to go with so-and-so, president, whatever. And he said, but everybody stand by. The leader of the free world, I quote, leader of the free world will be at the White House, and Trump will be there as well. Well, one of the staff gave Trump the tweet. And so he gets out of the car, and Trump jabs him instantly over his clothes. Like the man isn't even in the door. And Trump says, oh, wow, you got dressed up for this, huh? And then looks at all the cameras and goes, look at this guy dressed up for this. They said that was when Marco Rubio was like, oh, man, this is going to go bad. So let's talk about a little bit about just introductory things. So you've done the groundwork for conflict resolution. Say your people have all been communicating. What do you need to do as a leader to try to make sure that all of what your people have done get across the line? Like, do you meet the tone that they are setting and taking? Do you take your own approach? What, just from a beginning standpoint, what should have they been looking at?
Yeah, for me, the way I have to parse this is I have to think about it in terms of what would good leadership look like, and that's a point of view. Then there's sort of biblical leadership that I might overlay on top of that.
Yeah.
And then I might look to Trump in terms of what he's trying to accomplish. And he has an outcome that he's trying to accomplish. This is an opportunistic, and I don't want to be overly disparaging, but
Yeah.
this is an opportunistic opportunity for him that will present itself maybe once in his lifetime.
Right.
The opportunity to actually get these rare earth minerals. And, candidly, to use Trump's words, Zelensky he's on the ropes. He has no cards.
Right.
And so he has taken advantage of that. So I have to parse it across all of those. In terms of tone for tone, I don't believe that Trump demonstrated what I would consider strong leadership.
Okay.
And there's a great point of view, scripturally, when we think about, if your brother has transgressed, go to him in the spirit of meekness, consider, right? And I get that, there wasn't necessarily a transgression on the part of Zelensky, but this idea that the stronger person, that the leader, the one that has more cards, to use Trump's,
Yeah.
he has a duty of care to the person that he's approaching. And I think he was overly strong in regards to that duty of care, that he didn't need to be as vociferous as he was. He was quite loud. He was quite domineering in terms of the conversation. He is the one that is the leader in that room by all intents and purposes, in the sense that he is the leader of the free world.
Yeah. So what'd you think? He bullied him a bit? Do you think it was a blind side? How do you view that? Do you think there was ample time to parse it out, or why did Trump do it in front of the video cameras?
Oh, that's a very large question, why he did it. One of the things I think about from a leadership, and it's kind of this pithy statement that leaders create, they don't compete, right? And this idea that as a leader, you're trying to create capacity, you're trying to add improvement, you're trying to move things forward. And even when Zelensky, mentioned Europe, and you could see that it wrinkled Trump, because it's like, whoa, you're taking away my Nobel Peace Prize. I'm being facetious, obviously.
No, no, you're not.
I know.
He really does want that.
He really does want it, right? And so this idea that, again, leaders, they create, they don't compete. And Paul said this, 1 Corinthians, right? I'm glad that I didn't baptize you other than Gaius. And, was Paul crucified for you? Did I baptize you?
Yeah.
Trump doesn't want to share the glory. And so there's just so much there in terms of how he came at him. Did he ambush him? I don't know if I would call it an ambush, but he clearly got off script.
Yeah. So do you think that part of the problem is there was just and I've thought about this, two people come to the table, they're both sitting down, they're trying to find common ground. Right. But if you have divergent agendas, there's almost nothing you can do if you're not willing to find the one common thread that each party has. Did you see that as just a complete divergence of agendas? Or do you think it developed into that?
And we could argue. I thought at some point we might get into a little bit of Sun Tzu and the art of war. This idea is from a strategic and from a negotiating standpoint, it felt like it went off the rails in a bunch of ways. And I don't disagree that Trump somehow needs to be the mediator, that somehow he has to be in the middle. And if he speaks overly disparaging towards Putin, then can he actually bring Putin to the table? And so there's a bunch going on there that we would have to unpack. But it seems to me that there are different agendas. One has high doubt, high suspicion. One doesn't believe anything Putin says. And one's trying to secure something, mineral rights, for the benefit of the U.S. citizens and probably bring an end to the war. But I'm not sure his motivation to bring the end of the war is as altruistic as he might like us to believe, that it has an economic effect that he's more concerned with than the altruism of bringing peace.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And I think to his credit, he starts in by saying, I'm not aligned with Russia. I'm for America. And then he quickly added an addendum to that, as well as the world. I'm aligned with the world. But he was honest. That's an America first policy, which that's what he gets paid to do. That's what he was elected to do. Okay. Now, what was your thoughts around J.D. Vance? Like when you compare the 2015-16 screaming match, you ever watch that? So Trump's sitting there, he's threatening to shut down the government. He's got Chuck Schumer and Nancy Pelosi, and I mean they're just having it out right there on public television. Okay, Pence sits there just like completely frozen. He's horrified. Vance actually weighed in, which from a communications standpoint, you've worked with me for 4 years now, okay? I don't think that the guy who's in charge should be the only guy talking. Mm-hmm. So from my perspective, the way I think, love it that J.D. Vance spoke up and was engaging. And that's what you have help for. That's what you have men around you for. Not to just sit there and be yes men. But little tacky that he hit him for campaigning for Kamala Harris, and a little tacky that he knocked him for not saying thank you kind of thing. So even though it's great that he's finding his legs to stand on, his communication was a little off. Do you agree with me that that's a little bit nitpicky?
Super nitpicky.
Okay.
I would call it paternal, bordering on paternalistic.
Okay.
Like, say thank you to the nice man for giving you the ice cream. Say thank you to the nice man, and it seemed a little bit contrived and a little bit paternalistic. Like, yes, thank you, a million thank yous. But Zelensky has a lived experience,
right,
that neither of these men have, and I'm not suggesting that the U.S. hasn't seen their share of troubles and conflict, but he has a lived experience that, look, I don't want to be criticized about what I'm wearing today. It sort of reminds me of the scripture, right? Like I don't have time to come down from the wall. Like if we're going to talk about, I didn't say thank you enough times, or if we're going to talk about I didn't dress up and disrespected the office, probably don't have a lot of time for that. So again, I felt like they were both so polarized in their points of view that while I think J.D. Vance tends to be quite articulate, he seems to generate great ideas. I like the way he speaks.
Yeah,
I like
do
the way
too.
he brings thoughts to the table. I wasn't sure that it was a meaningful contribution at that time, and I think he has so much more to contribute, and he missed that opportunity in that round, if you will.
Yeah, I agree. The other thing on the dress is, and I get it, there is protocol and there is decorum within the office, but I think you have to be consistent. This goes back to even a leadership thing in Scripture, is you're allowed to make a judgment, but judge righteous judgment. An unequal balance is an abomination to God, right? So even as a leader, I'm constantly conscious about, okay, someone comes to you and they say, well, this person did X, and you're like, okay, well, I'm really not going to go on a witch hunt here, but we do need to strengthen our policy. Okay, so let's make it just even across the board, and then it takes care of itself kind of thing, right? As opposed to going to one person and nitpicking. So like when you see, like Trump has the guts to call him out on his dress, which he's been very consistent on since the war started. He's wore this leisure athleticism outfit, you know. And then one of the reporters and Vance kind of poked at him about it. Now, that's inconsistent because nobody says a word to Elon, who's standing in a T-shirt and a hat with a booger-picking kid, right? That's cool. That's not denigrating the office. So that, to me, kind of rankled. I'm like, as a leader, you've let other things slide for your friends. Don't, you know. So to me, I think about abuse when I see, like, in spiritual abuse is primary my concern. When the largest man with the largest platform with the loudest mic picks on the littlest issue, that's spiritual abuse to me, right? So that's my definition. When I look at that and I think, come on, guys, you're the leaders of the free world. Pony up and let's talk about substantive things.
And the thing, just to build on that, is it is an incumbent upon you as a person in the room in that particular scenario, not to me too, like, bring new contact. Like, there's lots of opportunity for new ideas. Like, what Vance, I don't think, did is he didn't advance a new idea. He basically dogpiled on the scolding is the part that is to me a little bit disappointing, because there was lots of new information to bring. They didn't talk about strategy. Vance could have easily gone off and say, look, let's talk about this. Let's talk about what security guarantees look like. Let's talk about compromise and the art of negotiation. And we could do that today. Like, compromise is a terrible word in terms of negotiation. And I think they talked about that. But Vance could have brought, the point of all this is Vance could have brought new information to the party. But what he didn't do is he just continued the scolding. And I thought that was a little bit cheap.
Yeah, I agree. So the other thing, I'm going to make one quick point about body language. So I was 5-6 years old when Ronald Reagan stormed out of Reykjavik. Am I saying that right? Reykjavik. He just gets up and leaves. I mean, and that the world had never seen a leader just say, I'm out. If that's what you guys brought me over here for, I'm gone. We're not going to make a deal. And he leaves. Now, I've read a lot of books about it, right? But that was kind of a moment right there that reminded me of Reykjavik. You know, you see this, I'm standing my ground on all their parts. But let's look at it from a body language real quick, and then we'll move on to kind of the next thing I want to talk about. The diplomatic corps and diplomacy analysts and specialists, all my life I've heard them say, you do not point. So presidents will, like, did you see the finger pointing going? Like, so the aggressive posturing is like, and I have to ask myself, is he, because he would even pause and look at the camera like, are you getting this? Everybody get at this? And you're like, okay, is he crazy like a fox? Is there a method to this madness? Or is he just tired of being, not heard and he's going to get his way? Do you think, from the body language perspective, do you think the aggressive posturing was there on all parts or just Trump?
I think Zelensky at some point also began to sort of lean into the aggression, based upon, again, this lived experience that he has. But it went from sort of aggression to patronizing, like even that the hand behind him. Like, I can't figure out how intentional Trump is. If he just does what he does and just, it's a stream of consciousness and it happens.
Yeah.
Or if he, in fact, there's some intentionality about when he's putting his hand, what he's doing. He seems to have some intentionality around the way he likes to shake hands.
Yeah.
But it sort of, for me, it went from both patronizing to aggressive, and he sort of went back and forth. And I'm not sure whether he did it with pure intentionality or if he just did it because he was so lit up.
Yeah. Now, if you look at Macron, who was there last week, he called Trump out. And I was from a body language angle. Did you see that one?
Yeah.
He grabbed Trump's arm and says, no, respectfully, that's not true. We did give money. You know, it's like, wow, that is a hands-on approach. You know, normally that's not the way them diplomats work. So there's obviously a little bit of raising of the body language cues in this whole world attempt to, you know, engage with Trump. Everybody's acting different, in my opinion. But what's fascinating is how you see where Zelensky leans in and multiple times trying to get a word in edgewise. He's poking at him. Yeah. And so, you know, have you ever been in a situation where the intensity was so great, the emotion, that you did kind of lose self-awareness? Mm-hmm. And what should a leader do when he feels like he's losing self-awareness? Because it's obvious these guys were not even thinking about the cues on their body language.
Yeah. I mean, the answer is stop talking.
Yeah.
Right. Stop talking. Put your hands back on your own knees and lean forward in a listening, empathetic sort of posture.
Yeah.
They fueled each other. Like each of them brought a few logs to the fire, and once the fire got lit, they started putting logs on the fire. And I think they both realized that they overstepped. It would be surprising for me for Trump to not realize that he was sort of a little bit provocative, overly so. I would say Vance is probably thinking that he was probably somewhat condescending, that paternalistic say thank you to the nice man who gave you the ice cream.
Yeah.
I think all of them in retrospect will realize that their communication wasn't on point. Stop talking is the answer.
Okay. All right. In vein of body language, how does a leader manage visible frustration? Like, it wasn't just aggression. You could tell these men were genuinely frustrated that this was like, at one point, Trump's just like exhaling and shaking his head. What's the difference between authenticity, because leaders have to show their emotions, and what is the reasonable expectation that we don't let visible frustration? I know that how I walk into church sometimes can set the tone. If I come in somber and I spend the first 5 minutes in, deep and somber prayer, people's like, oh boy, here it comes, Yeah. So you got to find this balance. What's the balance in leadership between authenticity and managing your visible frustrations?
I think it's, as you and I always talk about, is intentionality, is first be aware of yourself and aware of the appendages, aware of these things. You got these things at the end of your shoulders, like what are they doing? Where are they? What are they suggesting? Facial expressions, all of that. And the intentionality requires you to say, okay, am I going to be mirroring? Am I leading or following? And depending upon what you're trying to create in terms of the tone, you will either lead in terms of creating some body motion so that people will actually hopefully mirror you. We've all got those mirror neurons that we talk about. Or you follow and you say, when he leans forward, you lean forward. When he puts his hands on his knees, you put your hands on your knees.
Yeah.
Right. And so trying to make sure that you play with that a little bit, but it's the ability to have the awareness to say, I'm going to start playing with some of these mirrors. So, if it's a lean back and rub the chin, or if it's a lean forward with your hands on knees, you're playing and you're conscious of what that's playing like in the response of the other person. But you have to be so intentional, especially in these high stakes communications. But they just, even early on, I would say Zelensky was he was kind of shaking his head, and he was sort of like, I can't believe this. And, he did not maintain what I would consider a respectful posture, given the audience and given where he was. Now, I'm not suggesting he had to kiss the ring, but there was a sense of his posture that did not suggest to me one of deference to the office. Now, should Vance have gone off on the tangent? No, but notwithstanding that, his awareness around this, I think, was lacking at the beginning. From probably 3 or 4 minutes in, his awareness around his posture and the messaging that he's sending. Even he seemed to have a secondary conversation to somebody sort of smiling in the audience and sort of nodding his head, like, this, You got 15, 20 minutes. I don't know what the full exchange was, but you have 20 minutes with this person. You haven't got time to be looking to your left, to your right, or having a little chuckle with somebody. You better be staying on point to every word, because the nuances of these conversations are so, so important.
I agree. And let me let me weigh in on what you're saying. The nuance, the high, you're using all these words, right? High stakes, the tension, the nuance of it, the pressure of it, right? It's as high diplomatically as you'll ever get in the free world, right? Overconfidence is a bad deal for leaders, isn't it? Like, he chose not to use an interpreter. And Andrew, words matter. And those, like your talk, you keep using the word nuance. Like, if English is not your mother tongue, you should probably be a little more humble to say the stakes are very high. And while I'm proficient in communication, I want to make sure that it gets translated properly. How big of a mistake was it for him not to use a translator, and speak a little bit after that to overconfidence in leaders?
Right. So I think the translation thing goes both ways. I think the setup has to be so, so important in the way that you use a translator, because one message that you're projecting is, I'm not speaking your language. No, there is not a global language called English. In fact, we all have this diversity of language, blah, blah. And so if you set it up in a way that looks like you're not being deferential, or it sets up in a way that you're being a little bit arrogant about it, then that can backfire you on you as well, because now you're asking them to speak to a secondary person and you're not getting the full. So I think the setup for that really matters. Because Zelensky's well-versed in English, and again, it's not his first language, but well enough that he's spoken to Parliament, he's spoken to Congress, he's spoken across the world in English, he probably should not have used an interpreter, I don't think, unless he could set it up in a way, because it can come off as so arrogant, I think. Putin is the kind of guy that wants you to speak through his translator, right? Because I'm not coming down to your level. You're going to come up to my level. So I think it depends. I really do. I think he could have played it either way, but the setup would have mattered the most. Is like, this is so, so important to me, and so important to the free world, or so important to our countries.
Yeah.
I've opted to use a translator to make sure I get every bit of nuance associated with your words, because there are words that I don't understand. And he was in one interview where he had to actually ask the translator for some clarification on some words.
Right.
And so he knows he has that potential to not fully follow the through line. And so I think the setup would have had to be really well done for him to do that effectively.
Yeah. Because Macron can speak English, and they chose to do it through an interpreter. And the stakes were that high, you know? And so like you can see him say, yeah, but there's an ocean between you, and you will one day feel the pressure. Don't you tell us what we're going to, you know what I'm saying? I don't actually think he meant that. I think what he meant was, you're not as insulated as you think you are.
100%.
You know, I don't think he was threatening, you're going to feel it soon.
Right.
He speaks street English, not diplomatic, you know, or academic language. And so that kind of, to me, backfired.
It did, but, you know, again, at that point, Trump is already living in his limbic system. Like, he is not thinking at this point. Anything you say is going to be interpreted in a negative way. Like, you know, you don't understand our lived experience. We don't understand war. You don't think we don't have investments. We have $350 billion committed to this.
Yeah.
You think it seemed like that the conversation had degraded to such a place of being irredeemable, and that everything that would have been said would have been viewed with some skepticism, with some sense of either it's a slight or backhand. It had gone so far off the rails at that point. I think the best advice was stop, even then.
So because he used the word again, he said, He said, yeah, but we've been doing this alone. And boy, they lit into him over that. I don't think he actually meant that. I think it's just he's using the English he has.
Yeah.
You know, and I'm thinking, man, who let him in the room
Yeah.
without, an interpreter? That's my view. So before I do a roundup of a few things, I'm going to give it to you to take kind of the lead here. What are some of the things that you think people should be looking at or we should be talking about in light of this interview and this leadership? Are we missing anything so far? Or?
Well, I think that, the three components is sort of the lens, if you will, that I sort of put it through when I was watching. It's like, what does Scripture say about like how should I approach this? What is it? You could go to Matthew 18, of course, and say, does that actually, this is a world high stakes environment. But is there something, if your brother has aught against you, go to him and like, what is there in that we could gain from it? If you see your brother in a fault, or you see somebody who's weakened, what should my posture look? So I think there's a scriptural component that we need to think about as leaders. How do we respond to situations of care and need?
Right.
And so I think there's a lot there we could talk about from empathy. And then there's sort of the secular leadership perspective, which is, you think about communication. How was the communication done? This idea of leaders create, they don't compete. And it was highly competitive. It wasn't, we're going to create something better between the union of this agreement, but in fact, it was purely competitive. It was, I want to make sure I get all the accolades. I want to make sure I get the Nobel Prize. It was just so off the rails. And I think this idea, this fundamental belief that leadership is about, and I think of leadership versus management, that leadership is about people getting better and management is about systems and processes getting better.
Yeah.
And so I think it degraded very quickly to a management discussion. And so I think there's a leadership frame that we can think about that wasn't. And then I think the whole strategic, like the fact that there was no discussion about the strategic part. Sun Tzu, and you think about, the real victory comes when you don't have to go to battle, right? That's when real victory is achieved, when you don't have to go to battle, or knowing whether you can win or you can't win. That's when you see victory. There's a great quote by him that says, strategy with tactics is the slowest way to victory, but tactics without strategy is the noise before the failure, or the noise before the defeat, right?
Good.
And so there's all of this, I think, strategic language that didn't actually make it into the conversation about, and compromise. We talked briefly about this idea of compromise, and compromise is a terrible word to ever use in a negotiation. Compromise, one should never compromise in a negotiation. And I think they were on this thing of like, well, you're asking me to compromise. No, I'm not asking you to compromise. What I'm asking for is to figure out where you're going to create value and we can create value together. So anyways, the point of that was to say that third component, or that third lens, is that we didn't look through it strategically. Nobody talked about the strategic implications. There was a throwaway line about this is World War III and you don't know where. That's not strategy. That's a threat.
Right.
And so I think that lens was missed as well. So I think for me, that's how I was sort of kind of in that process going through it.
Yeah. Okay, so I'm gonna wrap it up by doing this. I'm gonna ask you 3 questions because I'm very interested in you and your views. Okay, so Andrew Bentley is in the room as Zelensky. What do you do different than what he did, or what do you do like him?
So, like him?
You're Zelensky right now. What do you do?
Yeah, he didn't mind, I would say, the first thing, that he may not have understood the full terms of the agreement. Like the fact that we're having an argument about security guarantees versus ceasefires, like that language should have been absolutely well defined within the document. And if there was no language associated with that, then shame on him for not coming to the negotiation with not a better understanding. There's a reason at the beginning of contracts they have all the definitions. Like, what does security guarantee mean? What does ceasefire mean? So that to me is the first failing. The second thing I would say is he did a poor job of finding common ground. And look, nobody is under the delusion that Trump doesn't come with a level of egotism to everything that he does. And that's just, I don't say that to be unkind, but it's just the reality of who you're dealing with. And so there was no Venn diagram set up whatsoever. Like, where is the common ground? There are things that we agree on. We agree on the fact that you've committed $350 billion. We agree on the fact that you provide, we agree that we're in the room today making a negotiation. Like, there are so many areas of agreement, and they didn't mind for any of those. And I think that was a failure. And then the third thing, he fell into the trap, is he responded. And that's the unfortunate, is he took the bait on Trump's.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so that's all very good, and that's helpful to think when you're the guy that's coming in on the lesser end of the power spectrum. Mm-hmm. You better have your terminology nailed down. Mm-hmm. You kind of weighed in on what you would have thought or done different as Trump. You know, the leader, the responsibility of him to be more magnanimous or whatever. You know, anything else you would have done different as Trump?
Well, it's hard to find what he did well. You know, and I get he's the main event, and so I appreciate the fact that he is the main event. There's so many things, like he could have been more empathetic. He could have been kinder. There's a lived experience that these people have, that at $500 million or $1 billion a day of burn rate, that this war is consuming, the toll of lives, there's just so many of that. Like, some empathy would have been appreciated, and I think would have been respected. And I get that, you know, he may not enjoy weakness, and he may not see that empathy is good. Yeah. But, you know, even that, like, there's just something virtuous about somebody that realizes they're holding all the cards, again, to use his word, and to actually be willing to show a few of them. Yeah. Like, I don't have to come out. There's a great quote by Larry Ellison, founder of Oracle. He said, "It's not enough that I win, all others must lose." And I think this zero-sum game of leadership, and because it's not leadership, but this zero-sum game like that is destructive. And it doesn't move people forward.
Right. I agree. You're the second man in the room. You're J.D. Vance. You already mentioned earlier that you would have tried to contribute new information or new. What is it? We've talked before, even on this podcast, on leading up. Mm-hmm. You know, trying to get a leader to see a different perspective. Would you have tried to somehow guide it, or as a second man? Would have you tried to engage with Zelensky, or would have you tried to engage with Trump at all?
I think the opportunity was to engage with both of them. He was the observer in the room, as was Marco. Either of them could have brought that conflict to not a resolution, but they could have lowered the temperature of the conflict. And I don't think that they did that. At the stage they were at, there was no value in putting more wood on the fire. I think the opportunity was to diffuse some of the tension, not to increase the tension. And so I feel like that was a miss on his part, that he didn't take advantage of that opportunity.
Yeah. That's a fair estimation. Well, you know, the thing about it is I know this isn't completely fitting to the Christian thing, but Christians watch this stuff. Christians are filtering through this, and there's a lot of people that like or dislike or are engaged or disengaged because of stuff like this. So from a leadership and communications perspective, I think it is important that we do talk about world events. I think the church can become so insulated, and I'm very bad at it. Like, in the pulpit, I just do not ramble off doing this. My rules are hard and fast. You know what I'm saying? I'm there to preach Christ, Him crucified, and preach the word. 3-word job description. This provides me a way to say, hey guys, when you're watching this, try to unpack, like you said, in stack rank, like where's the Christian piece in this? Where's the global leader piece? And, you got to learn to discern. You can't just automatically look at something and say, oh, okay, this is the way that it is. There has to be a discernment part about it. And so that's why I always appreciate when it happens like this. I tell Preston, get Andrew in here, let's talk about this. Because it's fun. It's fun to look at and talk about. And so anything you want to wrap up with before we go? Anything you want to add to it, or before I make my final comments?
Yeah, I just leadership matters. And I think we all know that. And this idea of unconditional positive regard, like, where is the opportunity now for Zelensky to redeem himself? And I think as leaders, we're always trying to, because there are crucial conversations. There are times when we have to say things that don't land well. But at the end of that, there has to be some redemptive opportunity. And I don't know that, again, that they provided that redemptive opportunity. And for me, that's the sadness, is because now he's going off and there is a conflict, and it has some global scale to it. Like, it is, It is meaningful. And so without that redemptive opportunity, I feel like we're no further ahead. In fact, we're probably taking a few steps back. And so my encouragement to leaders is always make sure that even in those crucial conversations, there is always a redemptive opportunity as part of that.
Yeah, that's a perfect wrap up. My wrap up was, Preston will probably be able to put this in, but there was a tinge of real pain for me spiritually. And when I watched him walk out alone, I've been there as a leader where I had to do what I had to do. I had no choice. I had to make my stand. But when they walked away, there was a brokenness in me of what could have been. Because when you lose dialogue, you lose the access to potential and opportunity. And there was that moment where he walks out like alone. Well, I mean, one woman walked out and shook his hand, but his entourage wasn't with him. His press corps, his ambassador wasn't even with him. And he's sitting in the truck alone. And Andrew, that got me, because I've had situations where no matter who was in the right and who was in the wrong, there's that moment where, fine, let's go our separate ways. And it grieves me. And so as a leader, I always am looking for, how do I keep them in the room? How do I keep them in the conversation and engage them? So if you're watching this and you're thinking about this, all of us have conflict. Conflict resolution is part of our Christian experience. And Matthew 18 lays that out. But whatever you do, try to keep people at the table, negotiating, talking, giving themselves over to a better way and a better world. And so that's where I'd like to end this by saying that all of us can do everything we can to not try to implement secular things. When I look at this, I see Jesus saying, don't rule like the Gentiles rule. This is the way the guys do it, okay? And they will let you walk away, and there won't even be a tinge of guilt about it. Sorry, bud, that's what you get when you play in the big leagues. But as a Christian, I don't want to be a president. I don't want to be a prime minister. I want to be a preacher of the gospel. I want to be a brother. And ultimately, I want to be a Christian. So thank you, Andrew, for being on this. I always enjoy talking to you.
Thank you.
And if you're watching Truth Talk and you're a part of this, just consider as you watch all this, how do we be better and more effective Christians? Thank you.